Thank you kindly. Hope everyone can hear me if I project a little bit in the back. So I've been on the road a fair amount, and I was talking about free trade in Bangkok and then in Hanoi, and I figured I was in the neighborhood, Johannesburg not being far from Hanoi, and it's on my way to the United States, where I'll spend 4 days with my cats and then go to Brazil and then Turkey, Afghanistan, and Uzbekistan. So that's my next few weeks. But what I'm going to talk about today, I'll make sure I get out of the way here, is a topic that's very important, and it's been dominating the news, partly because of the political figures that are involved. And it has to do with trade wars. And this, by the way, is a book. I brought a few copies that I had edited a couple of years ago on the case for free trade. And one of the most important elements behind that is it is one of the most powerful engines of peace among nations is freedom of trade. Well, the title refers to this famous tweet of Donald Trump, which he then has repeated many times. When a country, USA, is losing many billions of dollars on trade, I'll talk about that, with virtually every country does business with, trade wars are good and easy to win. So I want to talk about these questions, and I'll run through them in order. A little bit of a crash course, if you will, in economics of trade. So let's start with, what is a trade war? It's a negative-sum game. So if we think about game theory, there are 3 different kinds of games, broadly, that people can play in terms of the payoffs. Zero-sum game means that the adding the benefits sums to 0. If you gain 10 and I lose 10, we add them together, it's 0. Lots of people think that characterizes the world. These are very unusual. You almost never find a zero-sum game. Much more common in the win-lose mentality is the positive-sum game. That's the game of trade, in which the sum of the benefits is greater than 0. And we find that in all voluntary exchange is a positive-sum game. You see the little hint when you go into the store and you buy something, and the merchant gives it to you, you say thank you, and the merchant says thank you. Both of you gained. It's a double thank you. It's a positive-sum game. But then the negative-sum game, the sum of the benefits is less than 0. Crime, robbery, corruption, these are all negative-sum games. Think of all the dictators in the world and the money that they stole. If you return that to the people, it's a small fraction of the harm that they caused. If you get robbed by someone going down the street and someone beats you or hurts you, if they beat me, they'd get about 40 American dollars, which is what I have in my pocket right now. But that person's medical bill after I'm done retaliating is going to be more than $40, I can assure you. That's going to be a negative-sum game for sure. Trade wars are a negative-sum game, with no question. People trade because they expect what they give away is worth less than what they get. People trade in the anticipation of a benefit. And when you block that, you harm both parties. That's the most important point. Both parties are harmed when you stop them from engaging in a voluntary trade. In addition, there is retaliation. Here's Peter Navarro, Trump's trade advisor. I don't believe any country in the world is going to retaliate. Well, that didn't turn out to be correct. That was false. That claim is absolutely false. And if you look at the impact, China retaliated tariffs averaging 16%. This has caused massive harm to not only the Chinese, but to American producers who would like to sell to the Chinese market. There's a true zero-sum mentality. As Trump said, I'm a nationalist. A globalist is a person that wants the globe to do well, frankly not caring about our country so much. We can't have that. He cannot imagine people benefiting together, jointly, on the basis of trade. In his view, if you gain, he loses. And if he gains, you lose. That's his view of the world. And it's fundamentally in error. Think about the consequences of a trade war. There's something in economics, a very robust theorem called the Lerner symmetry theorem from Abba Lerner. A tax on imports has in the aggregate the same impact as a tax on exports. And that's true of quotas or any other kind of restriction. If you make it harder to import, you make it harder to export. This is very important. When you make it hard to import, you're hurting your exporting industries. They bear a tremendous loss from that. If you think about the logic of it, what are exports? They're the price we pay to get imports. What we want are imports. We were talking earlier today about Kenyan tea, which is very good. I produce things to export so I can get tea from Kenya. Virginia tea is not very good. I much prefer that. Or German automobiles, or cut flowers from the Netherlands, or whatever the good is. Exports are the price you pay for imports. If you're importing less, you'll be exporting less. And that is what has happened. We raise prices for our own consumers, and also we harm export industries, which is to say the higher value-added industries are hurt as a consequence. So it doesn't increase the gross employment in the economy. This is a fallacy. We're going to save jobs. The amount of employment has nothing to do with trade policy. That's a macroeconomic and labor policy question. It affects the composition of jobs, what kinds of jobs you have. And it destroys high-paying jobs to protect low-paying jobs. This is one of the most important points. You destroy high-paying jobs when you make it harder to export, and you make it harder to export when you make it harder to import. And we see what has happened with Mr. Trump's tariffs, that he said no one would retaliate. The evisceration of the American soybean market. This has been stunningly harmful to soybean producers in the United States. And of course the Harley-Davidson motorcycle, a sort of iconic image from America. They are producing them abroad now as a consequence to avoid these retaliatory tariffs. So we want to think about what is trade, get into the right mentality to understand what happens with trade. Imagine you have a factory, a great automated factory, and the top scientists in the world have put all of their creative effort into this new factory, nanotechnology and all kinds of high-tech things. In one gate here, you put things that you can make at low cost. And out the other gate, after it's transformed in the factory, are things that are costly to produce that come out. This would be a value-adding factory. And everyone would applaud the scientists who invented this and acclaim them as heroes, until one day a journalist sneaks in with a camera and discovers it's a fraud. It's not a factory at all. It's a submarine port. Goods are being brought in, put into the submarines, and sent out, and then they come back with goods from abroad. So Americans are putting in soybeans and sending them out, and then iPads are coming back. Right? That's what trade is. Trade is like a factory that turns things that are low cost to produce into things that are high cost to produce. Trade is a machine, if you will. So if you think about what is it that farmers in Iowa are growing, you think of them as growing corn and soybeans. They're growing Japanese and German cars. That's what they're growing, because they grow the corn to sell and they buy those wonderful Japanese and German automobiles. So every year they go out and tend their crop of automobiles, which they're growing in their fields. So we see it wasn't a factory, it's just free trade. Free trade is a value-creating mechanism. Now what about trade deficits? President Trump said it's losing money. And here I want to run through a little bit of dry economic statistics and economic accounting, but it's important to counter the silliness. This man, Wilbur Ross, attacked the Wall Street Journal. The Wall Street Journal was critical of Mr. Trump. Very gently, they said, these policies don't make any sense, which is a polite way of saying they're completely mad. He said, no, you're wrong. It's Econ 101. That's your first course in economics. Gross domestic product equals the sum of domestic economic activity plus net exports. Exports minus imports. When we run massive and chronic trade deficits, it weakens our economy. He believes all imports subtract from gross domestic product. Now, this man is Secretary of Commerce of the United States of America. He would flunk any Econ 101 class on any continent. It's unbelievable that this man is our Secretary of Commerce. So let's do a little bit of trade algebra. Gross domestic product is consumption plus government expenditure plus investment plus exports minus imports. He saw, minus imports. Minus imports. So if we reduce imports, we increase GDP. That's what he thinks is happening here and is now the basis of US trade policy. Well, do a little bit of algebra. Subtract these C and G and so on. It's GDP minus consumption minus government minus investment equals exports minus imports. Or subtract them out here if we're looking at a net savings in this case. We get this, or private savings plus government savings, which we don't have anymore in the era of deficits, minus investment equals exports minus imports, or a little bit more math, savings minus investment equals exports minus imports. What it means is if your imports are greater than your exports, your investment is greater than your savings. That's what that means. So if a country is running a trade deficit, people say, oh my God, that's terrible. I can tell you the same headline says as follows. Country runs capital account surplus. Foreigners invest in the country. That doesn't sound so bad now. If I told you, you should be ashamed. Foreigners find your country a good place to invest and do business. That would be strange, but that's in effect what Trump and Wilbur Ross are telling us. The fact is the U.S. is a massive attractor of investment from the rest of the world for a variety of reasons. And that is what is driving the trade deficit. There's nothing wrong with a trade deficit if you're importing capital. That's all it means. And the U.S. has run trade deficits for decades, during which time there's been massive economic growth and rising incomes. But Trump can't understand that. He thinks a trade deficit is the same as losing money. And that is a simple error of understanding. Now the reason, why do you deduct imports from exports? There's a reason for that. It's an accounting identity. It's not an equation of economic growth, which is what Wilbur Ross thinks. It's an accounting identity. And you already have counted imports in consumption. If I import apples from New Zealand and eat them, I consume them. Or investment, people import a machine that goes into productive activity. Or, in some cases, government will import things and consume them. If you don't subtract it, you count it twice. It's a very simple principle of accounting. That's why it's subtracted. But Wilbur Ross thinks it's the same as a loss. What you have with a trade deficit is a capital account surplus. Foreigners are investing in your economy. That's not by itself a bad thing or a cause for shame. So quickly on that, a current account deficit is the same as a capital account surplus. Net trade balances are affected by savings and investment, not by tariffs. It's a very important point. So when Trump was very proud, he took credit for a German company opening a factory in South Carolina. That act increased the trade deficit. But he doesn't understand that. He doesn't know that that is what happened. And finally, total employment is not affected by trade policy, but wages are. Protectionism lowers wages. That is a very important point we need to explain to the public. Think about what Trump has done even on the trade deficit front. He's added all these new tariffs. Well, the trade deficit should have gone down by his logic. No, it went up. We had under Obama 40.7 billion on average. It's up to 50.1 under Trump. All these tariffs are not diminishing the trade deficit, which he thinks is such an important goal. I want to address also an important question, why free trade is so important. It's not just about increasing gross domestic product or increasing wages, although those are certainly important, and certainly in a continent that has lagged behind the world in wages and economic growth and needs to catch up rapidly. There's another reason. It makes peace more likely and conflict less likely, and that is a good thing. Peaceful interaction rests on mutual advantage. Now, people often get confused about that. There's absolute advantage and comparative advantage. And the one economists talk about that's so important for trade is comparative advantage, not absolute. It's the foundation of beneficial exchange. And I'm going to give an example, a little bit of arithmetic, but not too much. And if you understand this, you will be so much better educated than the American Secretary of Commerce. That's setting the bar very low, but still it's something. This is really important. Paul Samuelson, the great economist, was once asked the question, can you name something in economics that is true and not obvious? And he thought for a while, and he finally answered, it's this. It's comparative advantage. It's very important, but it's not easy to understand. So I picked two random names, Tom and Temba. It's just not random. Temba is an old friend of mine from Cape Town, Temba Nolotshunga, that maybe a couple of people here know. We have an economy with two goods, apples and fish. And Temba has an absolute advantage in both. So if Tom, all day long, only gathers apples, he can get 50. And if only fishing, he could get 50 fish. That's his production frontier. 50 apples or 50 fish. But in the same time, Temba could get 100 apples. If you have ever met Temba, he was a boxer and a bodybuilder. And very tough guy. So he's good at everything. 100 apples or 200 fish. He's better at both. In economic terms, there's a technical economic term to describe Tom. Tom is a loser. Right? He just can't do anything well in comparison to Temba. Temba is better at everything. So why would Temba want to trade with Tom, who's a loser? Well, let's look at comparative advantage. Imagine that they produce in isolation with no trade. Each one of them had mothers who said, you need a balanced diet. Not all apples or all fish, but some fish and some apples. So they divide their time 50-50. Half the day gathering apples and half the day catching fish. Tom gets 25 and 25. Temba, half of 100 is 50, half of 200 is 100. So that's what they have when they're just producing on their own. Temba comes along, he says to Tom, because Temba's also smarter than Tom, he says, why don't we trade? Tom says, okay, let's try that. He says, I'll give you 37 apples for 25 of your fish. Did I get that right? No, I get the other way around, sorry. 37 fish for 25 apples. Tom shifts to 0, goes up to 50. Temba reduces from 50 to 25 and goes up from 100 to 150. So the numerical ratios are constant. There's no tricks in this. Then they trade. Tom had 50, Temba had 25. Tom shifts 25 over. Now 25 and 50, the same as if they didn't trade. Temba had 150 and Tom had 0. He shifts 37 over. Tom now has 37. Temba has 113. That's 12 more than if they didn't trade for Tom, and 13 more for Temba. That's strange. In effect, if they trade, they can consume more than they can produce. It's a kind of paradox. Why is that? Well, there's no trick to it. You have to think comparative advantage to understand what's happening here. Despite being less productive than Temba, Tom is the lowest cost producer of one of the goods. One apple cost him 1 fish. But 1 apple cost Temba 2 fish that he would have to give up. That's the production cost. What you give up. His production cost is twice Tom's for apples. But it's half of Tom's for fish. It cost him 1/2. So when they specialize, they're able to do more in the total. Share it together. They're both better off. It's astonishing when you think about what a powerful engine this is for human betterment. And for growing the market means we grow a larger market, a whole continent of Africa, of people producing different things that they can trade and specialize in what is their comparative advantage. Now there's a mistake that's very common I want to warn about. We don't know in advance what the comparative advantage is. You only find out through the market. No one would have predicted India's comparative advantage would be information technology. It happened and people were shocked, and now 300 million people have been lifted out of poverty in India. There's massive firms on the world scale doing IT work. No one would have predicted that 40 years ago. So trade creates civil society, and that civil society crosses borders. Zambia, Zimbabwe, Tanzania, South Africa. You create relationships across those lines that were drawn by European colonialists and reestablish African relationships among people to trade. Who drew the lines? They're not Africans. They were drawn in Berlin. Why should those stop people from trading? Because someone over 100 years ago made a decision in Berlin. And I'll conclude with this thought from a very important book, The Odyssey by Homer, the Greek poet. And I read it several times in my life. And one time I read it, I was injured and I couldn't walk for quite a long time. So I read a lot of books. And this jumped off the page. It's about when Odysseus meets the Cyclops. If you know the story, he goes on the island, he's shipwrecked, and the Cyclops is a savage and a terrible person. And he attacks and eats the members of the crew. And Odysseus says, "What is our guest gift?" Because it was traditional to give a gift if someone comes to your island on a shipwreck. And the Cyclops says, "I will eat you last." Which on the list, if you make an ordering of gifts, is a really low value gift. And then Homer says, why is the Cyclops a savage? And this was so striking. The Cyclops have no ships with crimson prows, no shipwrights there to build them good strong craft that could sail them out to foreign ports of call, as most men risk the seas to trade with other men. It's trade that humanizes us. It's trade that causes us to see other people as potential friends rather than food, as in the case of the Cyclops. So I hope that we are going to be seeing the birth of a $3 trillion economic zone, and that will go up and up and up because of the opportunities for trade in this great continent. This can be a continent of peace and prosperity and leave behind the past of colonialism and poverty. Thank you very much.